Thank you so much for coming out for this talk. I don't get a chance to talk about my work very much, so it's a great privilege. It prompted some soul searching. I have a lot of master's level students who are currently defending their master's level thesis projects, which I don't know, you might have to do as well, you students out there at some point. So I feel somewhat like I am having a thesis defense right now, because I had to kind of review my work and think about what is it that I'm up to? What am I doing? You know, what matters to me? I'm going to talk a little bit about my work at Oregon State University, including some science and environmentally related initiatives that I've been part of. And then I'm going to talk about my ecopoetic practice, the values that I try to carry through my experience of living on this planet and writing about the natural world and the human world. And then also there'll be time for questions. So if you are wondering how you become a poet in America, that's the time to ask, or about graduate school, or about, about anything about my work. I am open to any and all questions. The title of my talk is taken from my manuscript in progress, which is called Reckless Shelter. I'm a little bit of a word nut, so I love words that have multiple meanings. So if you think about this title, you might notice that I'm clicking the wrong computer. You might notice that the title Reckless Shelter can kind of spin out into a couple of other meanings. For instance, reckless sounds very much like reckless, like unable to be wrecked. That would be nice, wouldn't it, if our shelters were all unable to be wrecked? It may also bring to mind the definitions of marked by a lack of proper caution, careless of consequences. Certainly I feel that that describes the way the majority of our recent time period has lived on this earth, with a little bit of recklessness about consequences. You might also think about to reckon, which means to establish by calculation. So you can reckon up a figure if you're in math, right? Or consider or regard in a specified way. And there's also the archaic meaning wreck. So Hopkins has a poem, Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of my favorite Victorians, has a line from a poem which goes, "How do men yet not yet wreck his rod?" How do they not pay heed to, God's scepter, right? But in this case, I am employing it, but not in a religious sense, as like this need to pay heed to something, or this failure to pay heed to something. So this is a little bit of an introduction into how my mind works. I love language and wordplay. There are a lot of puns in my work. I work within a lot of constraints. I use a lot of form, like set forms. And I'll be talking a little bit about some of my more playful uses of poetic language as we look at some specific poems. So I'm going to read about 7 poems, but first I'm going to talk about my teaching, my interest in ecopoetry. I'm a big fan of the anthology. I think it's a very equitable way to represent lots of folks. And what I've realized, teaching nature writing and ecopoetry recently is that there have been a lot of fairly recent and some very recent anthologies that have come out. And I've used these excerpts from these in my teaching of ecopoetry on campus. So some of these students here will recognize these titles. Black Nature, edited by Camille Dungy, is a historical anthology, 400 years of African American nature poetry, trying to, again, through the principles of inclusivity, really feature diverse voices, understanding that nature has a very different meaning depending on your historical positionality, your race, your sexual orientation, your economic circumstances. So many things affect your sense of a relationship to nature. Then that came out in 2009. Ghost Fishing, I was excited to see that came out in 2018, is an eco-justice poetry anthology. So it's advertising itself as beyond eco-poetry. So there's an eco-justice poetry movement in the US, which has to do more with, again, inclusivity, at the embrace of generally historically marginalized voices and perspectives on nature. And then there's Queer Nature. I was very excited to see this anthology come out, edited by Michael Walsh in 2022. And that, again, is bringing other more diverse voices into the fold, talking about how, again, if you are from a queer orientation, your attitude, your feeling about nature, or the way you feel aligned with nature, or even disparaged through natural terms, like being called unnatural, it's profoundly affected by your position, your positionality. So these are some of the anthologies that I noticed. These 20 years ago did not really exist. I was raised on the canon of great elder nature writers. And so this, for me, is an exciting development because it does suggest that into the publishing world has come this more expansive understanding of what it means to write about the environment more broadly, not even necessarily the natural environment, perhaps the urban environment. There is the burgeoning field of disability eco-poetry, for instance, how disabled folks write about their interaction with the environment is becoming something of strong interest in the US, and I imagine that an anthology will be coming out about that as well. I work at a university that is known as the Science Flagship University for the state of Oregon. That means that we are an earth, air, sea, sky, I don't know, space. I don't even know. I get all the designations mixed up, but we are all things science. Our sister university, State University, University of Oregon, is known as the Humanities University, right? So what did this mean for me? Well, when I was hired 17, 18 years ago, I apparently was attractive to the hiring committee because my background, I come from a scientific family. That's all, apparently, if you're a poet, you can just rub elbows with a scientific family member, and it kind of rubs off on you. But my poetry was very interested in science and the natural world, and I had an unusual childhood upbringing in that it wasn't just a casual connection with science, but like I was the thumb in my father's, documentary photography when he was, collecting samples, right? I was with him on a lot of his scientific work. And so I was kind of brought up with an appreciation for especially field work and field biology because I accompanied him a great deal. And when I got to the the Oregon State University, I kind of found myself swept up in a few initiatives. These didn't happen right away. When I first arrived at Oregon State University, people were just talking about, wouldn't it be wonderful to integrate the arts and the sciences, right? To have them in conversation with each other. But still, the arts and the sciences were pretty segregated, and we felt very puny, we art folks and humanities folks felt pretty puny in this science university. But now, art is integrated into almost everything that happens at the university, it seems. So some examples are, I'll talk about the Spring Creek project a little bit more detail in a second. Some examples are the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. That is an OSU forest, a research forest that focuses on long-term research on forests and forest health in an area like ours, which is ravaged by wildfire increasingly. This is a hugely important task for the public health and for the health of the forests. So this is it is a research mission, but it has an art arm. So they have residencies. You can apply for a residency to go live in the forest and write about it. So they have not only long-term research, scientific research going on, but they have long-term ecological reflections going on where you as a writer or a painter, for instance, can go for 2 weeks and live in the forest. And what they do is they tell you to go and observe the same area, because they have a goal to have a 100-year snapshot. It's a very tiny piece of time within the life of a forest. But they want people to visit the same spot, write about the same spot, make art about the same spot, and then capture the snapshot of how that landscape has changed, or has, again, in what ways it has changed. So that's one thing I've been involved with. And then also the, another one is the Environmental Arts and Humanities Initiative. This is an explicitly interdisciplinary initiative to create new alliances between arts, humanities, and the environmental sciences. So it is an educational program. They do research and outreach, but you can get a master's degree in environmental humanities, and you can incorporate a great deal of creative writing and art making in that degree. I'm also involved with the Marine Studies Initiative. This is a BA program, so a Bachelor of Arts program. You can get a major in marine studies. And I developed curriculum for that program. I developed a course called Writing of the Sea, which is about oceans. I do write a lot about ocean creatures. I guess that qualifies me somehow. But my father was also a marine biologist. And so I was raised very much on the ocean. And then I wanted to talk a little bit more detail about Spring Creek. So Spring Creek is actually an initiative that brings together environmental science, philosophy, and the arts. And I feel most kind of at home in this particular OSU institution. So I put their mission statement up here. The Spring Creek Project brings together the practical wisdom of environmental science, the clarity of philosophy, and the transformational power of the written word in the arts to envision and inspire just and joyous relationships with the planet and with each other. And I mostly want you to look at this beautiful cabin, which is the site of a lot of residencies that I've been fortunate to take part in. It is in the Cascade Range, about 30 miles outside of Corvallis, where the university is located, about 30 minutes from the coast. And it is a sanctuary in all senses. So this might sound horrible to you where you are in your stage in life, but there's no Wi-Fi out there. None. Actually, now you can hike to a ridge and get a signal. I'm ashamed to admit this, because when I go there, I'm like, no, I don't want to be in connection with any, Wi-Fi. I don't want to be on the computer. I just want to observe. It is a place with a lot of forest around it, a lot of trails. So many of my poems have begun in walks in this forest. It's been a very special and important place for me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some overarching ideas that I think my poetry really invests in, and then we'll talk about, as I read some poems, we'll look at how those play out in specific ways. So there have been a lot of sea changes as I reflected on, in terms of what it means to be a nature writer. 20 years ago, being called a nature poet felt a little bit dismissive. Oh, you just write about nature, right? It has been incredible to feel as if you can proudly claim that you are a nature writer in this day and age, or that you are an eco-poet, and that is accorded so much more respect. And another term, about 20 years ago when I was beginning my young motherhood, that you had to be wary of as a poet was being labeled a mommy poet. That was very, very, dismissive. You're just a mommy poet, you write about being a mommy, right? Now there are so many things being written about motherhood and mothering and nurture generally, more broadly, kind of divorced from a notion of typical gender roles. There is an anthology called The Long Devotion of people writing about motherhood in all of its varied forms. Ocean Vuong has a book of poems called Time as a Mother. So he's meaning that in a couple senses, right? But the word mother is no longer, like motherhood is no longer, a cause for, having your work dismissed. My own upbringing, as I mentioned, was in the natural world. Field study practices were actually something that was a form of play for me. So my father would keep his field notebooks and I would keep my field notebooks. He would collect his specimens and I would collect my specimens. All of his books I stole off his shelves and they migrated to my shelves. Pond study, all that stuff. I did a pond study. I woke up every morning at precisely 8, went to a pond in March and took the water temperature and looked at it and drew it and studied it, looked at the water under a microscope and did a very profound mapping of it. That was play for me because I'm a geek. So, but I had this really good training. I had parents who were both knowledgeable who not only encouraged me but asked me to take it seriously. This observing the natural world. I also grew up on what I call human-haunted landscapes, which Poland you know a lot about. But I'll just go back, if I can, to that opening slide, if it will let me. Here we are. No, here we are. So this is the cove I grew up on. I grew up on a body of water called the Pocatanic Cove. That is a Native American word. If you take your canoe and you go around the tuft of grass there, those reeds, if you go around those, there was an archaeological dig there. And when I was a child, that was a very unsettling place because you could still see the trenches where the artifacts had been exhumed and things had been sort of mapped out and uncovered layer by layer. But there was always a sense growing up on that land that it was an upsetting, doom-laden sense of violence. And then I have relatives who were also violent with the land, which I'll talk about in a little bit and show you some images. So there were a lot of human marks on this land. And those inspired a lot of different feelings in me this has had lasting effects on my poetry. The sense of ethical ambiguity about even owning land has always, I want to own it, but I don't want to own it. When I'm on private land, I feel like possessive, like a lover. And when I go to public land, I'm like, this is for everybody. This is great. I don't have to possess you, right? So these are things that have really, they have seriously shaped me. My goal when I'm writing is to see the world clearly. If I'm writing about a slug, which I do, or a snail, I want to see it very, very clearly, accurately, and say what I see in a clear way, at least initially, before things start getting weird in the poem, right? Because poems have a life of their own. I want to render the world clearly. That is, to me, an act of respect for the world. I believe with Joy Harjo that the word is a living being and that it is a living material. It comes from our bodies. It originates in our brains, right? So I think of it very much as part of our body. I see language, in fact, as my spider silk. So don't tell me you kill spiders. I love spiders, and we'll talk about spiders in a little bit. But for me, language is very natural. All living entities express or have a language. They all express agency. They give shape to, respond to, and negotiate their environment with marks and signals. I'm very interested in exploring, questioning, reversing that sense of human superiority over nature. It wasn't the way I was raised. I was raised by my father that every living thing was a miracle. I had a poem accepted by a magazine, and the editor quibbled with me because I called a snail, a particular kind of marine snail called a cowrie. Do you know what a cowrie is? They make jewelry out of it. I called it an animal. He's like, I'm not really sure that's an animal. I said, I'm very sure it's an animal, right? So, yeah, it's an amazing animal, right? So it's an incredible animal. It can do all kinds of things that we can't do, right? So I want to collapse that binary. I want to use my poetry to magnify the splendors and the miracles of the natural world, the inventiveness, the weirdness of it. However, I feel ethically torn. I have a love-hate relationship to language. I feel whenever I'm inclined to render something painful beautiful, I feel ethically torn. I engage in self-scrutiny. I try to embody empathy and compassion, but I fail. It's a struggle. So a lot of my poems are kind of pinballing or shuttling back and forth between like the kind of guilty embrace of verbal lavishness and metaphor and like, listen, no, I can't do that. That's, I can't. I have to be more, maybe objective, scientific, like not be fanciful, right? I'll talk more about that when we look at some specific poems as well. But one person said of my work that it was scary tender. And that is the biggest compliment I could have gotten, because that's exactly what I'm going for. I want the poems to be scary and tender. I want my poems to be aware of precariousness, so to bear witness to environmental and human-made crisis and disaster, and to see how a lot of environmental catastrophes are actually human-made. There are other things I want to bear witness to as well. I want to bear witness to motherhood memorial making. I have a fairly elegiac temperament. Death is a significant preoccupation, that reality, that we are finite. Motherhood for me was a crisis because I had my infant daughter, my eldest daughter. She was just a few weeks old when the Twin Towers were, when they collapsed. So I had a response of, what have I done? Bringing children into this world. We have these moments. You've experienced the pandemic where you feel that life has changed forever, and you don't know how tenable living is going to be in the future, right? I had that very strong reaction, that kind of twinned with my sense of becoming a mother. What was that responsibility going to mean for me, and mostly for my children, for them, my daughters? But I try to also focus on wonder, humor, and abundance in the now, because that's also so very real. I have a lot of influences and inspirations. In this particular work, Reckless Shelter, I would say that the ones that really stand out are Roland Barthes's Morning Diary. This book is centered in a lot of ways around my mother's death from brain cancer. She had dementia before that and also suffered with chronic pain. But her cancer diagnosis was a complete surprise to us. Roland Barthes lost his mother, his very beloved mother, and for about 6 months, he took sheets of paper and folded them into quarters, cut them, and wrote just a few sentences every day about his grief for his mother and his attempt to understand what it means that his mother was no longer in the world. Like, how could he still be in the world if his mother still wasn't in the world? That was something that, I think the work is very beautiful. It was published after his death. He never meant it to be published, but it really fed into a lot of his theoretical work on photography. And that was a very important work for me. I read it pretty obsessively as I was working on these poems. Also, the poets, Alice Fulton, really loves language play. I find her work quite rewarding in that respect, very, very dense, very full of puns, very nimble. A.R. Ammons, of course, I share that with Christina. A.R. Ammons writes very close observations of the world. He used to keep a tape for, he made a long poem called Tape for the Turn of the Year on an adding machine tape that he fed into a typewriter. Very, very short lines on such a piece of paper. Every first entry, the first few lines were always, what is the weather doing today? That is like so me. I need to go out with my coffee and look and see what is the day like today? What can I see? What birds do I hear? What is my moment now of being on this earth like? Paisley Rechtel is also very, very important to me. She writes a lot about the American West, very engaged in the ethical self-scrutiny. She wrote a book about appropriation called Appropriation, which is about what it means to write about, for instance, a group she was writing about the Native Americans and their images captured by the Anglo-American photographer Edwin Curtis. So that has been very influential to me. And then there's some others. Ross Gay I'll just mention because Ross Gay just is the embodiment of gratitude and joy. So he doesn't overlook pain, social injustice. He's African American. But his attitude is like, look, folks, let's also praise. Let's take a moment to feel together, be on this whirling planet together. So that I've tried to let that influence me as well. Here is some beaver language. So these pictures are both my own photography I took at the Spring Creek cabin that I was telling you about that I love so much, Shot Pouch. I used to go in the evening and watch the beavers doing what looked like their very peaceful work of stripping the bark off of twigs and eating the bark and then taking that branch and threading it into their dam. But of course, beavers can do a lot of damage, right? But you know when a beaver has been present because it leaves its marks, right? Its signs. And then, humans, of course, are also leaving signs everywhere. And even as a child, I was very attuned to language in the environment. I noticed words and things on buildings, on streets. This is something I stumbled upon in the woods out near Shot Pouch Cabin, which is a frontier cemetery. It just tore me up to think about, like both the fate of the Native Americans who were displaced by the frontier expansion, but also the trials and sufferings that these people must have endured. So I sort of doomed. I have a lot of compassion. I tend to have a lot of compassion. I'm shuttling through compassion for both sides here, but this is a mark. This is a human mark on the landscape. That is an animal mark on the landscape. So haunted landscapes, human damage is something I write about a lot, versus dams, which is what a beaver makes. Language as material. So here, the language is material. It's cement, right? It is pressed into cement. And then mark making generally. I'm always looking for meaningful marks in the environment. So I'm going to read a poem called Daily We Home Wreck. There's a word called, there's a mode, this is a religious mode, but I don't use it in this sense, called adoxology or adoxology. It's the praise of something lowly. Something typically would be considered beneath praising. So this is, the spittlebugs you see on plants? They make that little bubbly nest. Do you know that? Have you seen those here? Do you have them in Poland? Yes? Well, I was at Shot Pouch and I brushed against one. and I realized that I had destroyed its home. So I thought about it for a long time. I thought about, like, a giant brushes against you and destroys your home. What's that? That must be pretty terrible, right? Or who knows, maybe not. Maybe you just build it again. I did all this research, because I believe in accuracy. I researched the spittlebug. It is the larva of the leafhopper. It creates this spit from tree sap, or from plant sap, which it drinks, and then it poops it out. It excretes it. In earlier versions, I said secretes it, and I changed it to excretes because that is accurate. So anyhow, this is a poem about wrecking home, but also about building a shelter in the language of the poem, and then questioning the folly of doing that. And I'm very much into folly. In Shakespeare's plays, the fools are always my favorite characters. But I'll go ahead and read this. Daily we home wreck. On my wrist, where it grazed the ox-eye daisy, a smear of foam, lace curtain in which a pale green wizard squirms. Blunt-headed, primitive-eyed, the finest dot of pencil on each side. Its only limb is a flake of fluke, a minute, cartoony whale who excretes its own sea, whose brief wisdom is to seek only the right-angled crux of a stout, square branch. Each stalk is a condominium of self-made dwellings. Each sphere of spit reflects a world, a fragile, fractal brevity. Here I go again, palace building. In place of infant spit bubbles, a surfeit from my brain, from my mouth, word by word, assembling this reckless shelter. So here the idea of a reckless shelter is that poem, right? That I cling to the idea of this poem as my memorial. That is my permanence in the world. No guarantee it's going to be read at all, right? So again, questioning of folly, thinking about the different ways in which the natural world expresses itself, finds language. Again, Gerard Manley Hopkins talks about natural beings as having their own, he says, myself, he says of a creature or even a plant, myself it speaks and says. He talks about like that everything is always, all natural things are always expressing who or what they are. That's been very influential to me. I also do a lot of field study or art. I don't really call it art because I don't really do anything with it, but this is my field notebook. This is also at Chop Pouch. This is a reflection. I took a picture of this reflection in the water, and then I tried to paint it just to think about how to really see it. What was really going on in this moving, wavery reflection? How could I capture it? How would that help me see it better if I could capture it? So for me, it's a mode of seeing. I'm very fascinated by reflective surfaces. Those images come up a lot in my poems, and in seeing clearly. And in field study. So here's a poem that I'm going to read that comes out of some of my field study tendencies. So this is set in the Cove that I showed you the picture of. It's on the first slide. So right now in this poem, I am actually on a raft, and I'm like this with my chin down. I'm looking into the water, and because I grew up there, I know a lot of these creatures. I know what I'm seeing. So, but you may not. So fry is a word for a very small hatchling fish. The comb jelly is a clear jellyfish. I don't know if you have these here. Well, actually, I didn't see any because I was at the coast this last weekend, and I did not see any comb jellies. But surely you have a clear jellyfish that sort of is iridescent. Sometimes it catches the light and sparks a little bit. And then there's this other thing called the sea squirt. It's just this blob, but if you touch it, it squirts at you. So these are very much childhood preoccupations of mine. Like this is like these, for me, these were like my playmates, right? But now I have children, and I'm watching them interact with this environment. So this is called the raft. I rest my chin on my hands, sink my gaze through the water. A cluster of fry dimple the surface, goggle-eyed, tails lashing. A comb jelly tumbles by on a pulse of incoming tide. Within the filmy sack, toothed filaments spark, a blitz of distant lightning. The rope, lumpy with sponges and tonsillar sea squirts, fades away in the broth. Much more of the world is invisible than visible. We put our trust in an imagined anchor. The neon buoys of my children drift out to the deep part, suspended in a body warm and crowded as their blood. They lick their lips to taste its salt. Exulting, they cry out, "We can't touch." So the kind of terror of seeing my children drifting out, they were wearing their life preservers, of course, but their excited thrill at not being able to touch is contrasted with my, what does it mean that we can't touch? A bottom, a surface, a stability. We put our trust in an imagined anchor. What holds us to this spinning planet, right? What gives us security? Lots of animals and creatures anchor themselves to the world in various ways. I think that my spirit animal is a spider. I think about spider silk as a really good metaphor for language. It is spun forth almost in an inexhaustible supply from your ass often. Sorry for this is being recorded, that was kind of vulgar. But then it develops intricate patterns. The spider makes an intricate pattern out of it. It uses it for shelter. It uses it as a way of movement. If you ever watched a spider walk on the ground, they're not nearly as graceful on the ground as they are on their web, right? That is their element. That is where they are most at home, in their web, for the most part, unless it's a species that's a burrower or whatever, right? That's possible too. Well, this is a picture of Philippe Petit, the French tightrope walker. This poem is the only poem I'm going to read from my second book of poems called Axis Mundi. This is the book. As I was mentioning, my daughter was born shortly before the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and before the collapse of the towers. And I heard on the radio an interview with Philippe Petit, who was talking about how what it was like to dance, he said, dance on the wire between the Twin Towers, a quarter of a mile above the pavement. And he specifically said he danced, right? It was the place, he said, where he felt most at home, most comfortable. Of course, when he gave that interview, the towers no longer existed. So what did it mean for him to see this place leveled? And, you know, your world changed for everybody profoundly, but for him it had a few other levels too. And as I was thinking about this interview, I was working on poems at my parents' house on this cove I showed you the picture of. And I was in thought about this particular image of Philippe Petit crossing this wire, and a little hatchling spider, tiny, tiny, was building a web from my glasses to the lampshade. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this has got to be a poem, right? So I wrote a poem called The Aerialist, but this idea of language as a way of embodying movement, right? Language is always in motion. It's always scrolling out of us. Poetry tries to embody that motion, often with some visual shaping. So as you're going to see in the next poem, there's a shuttling movement of indentation that is trying to capture that sense of movement. Poems move down the page too, right? Movement is self-expression. How a creature moves through the world is often a way it has of expressing who it is, its identity. And also movement and self-expression, as self-expression is often a way of making home. So a lot of the activities, when we think of animals being active, they are often building a shelter, right? Or trying to defend a shelter or create a place of structure for themselves, of safety for themselves. So this is called the aerialist. I detect a busy ordering in the corner of my eye and catch dust mote legs shuttling silk from a diminutive abdomen, plump as a full chignon. You float through the air, a swing on your trapeze, performing a dangling ritual dance off the temple of my glasses. Then, swimming up, anchor me to a line so fine I must assume it exists. A mathematical if-then whose idea I ride to the pleated lampshade's edge. You rock in the gale of my breathing, and I think of Petit flowing back and forth between the towers, inner ear telegraphing to the mind the 1,000 shifts of flexing pole required to hold his center of mass above the dividing line, to keep spinning peril into joy. It would be something to write a poem like that, whose thought flowed like current between two charged points, or to sit in balance upon a line and draw up to one from a quarter mile below the world's roar. So Petit would describe dancing across this wire between the twin towers and hearing the shum. What did he call it? I can't remember the French word. There's a word he used for this roar rising up from the pavement of all these voices. And here is my eldest daughter, Ava. We are foraging here for mushrooms. These are white chanterelles. Foraging is also an important metaphor for me in my writing practice. I think of writing a poem as foraging language. There is an incredible amount of language I feel I have to press into my brain in order to glean like a smallish poem out of it. So I prefer to read novels. In fact, I just need a massive amount of words coming at me. But also language, when you say you're foraging for food, you want to eat that, take in that nourishment, right? When you forage for language, you may find that language is actually pretty violent. So language is and can be very violent. And one of the things about the time that I wrote the aerialist poem that really struck me was there was a New York Times headline that's this right after the Twin Towers attack, when we were in the United States, we were all, it was New World, orange alerts, new protocols in airports, a sense of paranoia and so forth. And this quote says something like, the Pentagon was debating broadening the use of disinformation even among our allies. And I thought about this idea of disinformation, information and disinformation, and how language can be so, in fact, cruel, harmful, dangerous, as well as beautiful, tender, compassionate. I forage for language a lot. This is a poem that I wrote this was part of an initiative. I was asked with a bunch of other Oregon poets to choose a state wilderness area and go visit it and write a poem set there. Like literally draft the poem there, or from that experience create a poem. And this is what I created. But this poem is based on a very violent process, in some ways, of reduction. Because it is, all of these words are formed only with the letters of Dissolution Song, the title. I allowed myself to double letters. So DDIISSOO. So I use an anagram maker to develop a word bank. And I made this poem out of that word bank. It's also a kind of a weird sonnet, if you know about sonnets. It's a syllabic sonnet, so that first line, nothing's lost or done for, has 14 syllables, and it goes down by 1 syllable. And then the other poem starts at one, the other side starts at 1 and goes to 14 syllables. So huge amounts of restriction here. Why did I do that to myself? Why? What crazy impulse? I was thinking about dissolution. I was thinking about how much is conserved in the natural world, how very little is wasted. I was also thinking about a personal event in my life, which I was trying to recast in a more positive light, which was divorce. And when you go through divorce in the United States, it's technically called a petition for the dissolution. That's what it's called. So I'm thinking dissolution, right? There's so many positive ways to think about that in the natural world. It doesn't have to mean the end of something. It can be the beginning of a new making, right? So I was trying to take that word apart and remake it, but I couldn't help it from being sad. So it's a little bit sad, but maybe somewhat comforting. So it is not meant to be read across. It's meant for the first half to be read and then the second half to be read. I will point out that I cheated here, and I put an F in. I just got to the point where I'm like, ah! And I put an F in, but I thought it was in thinly, so that's how I justified it. Okay, so I'll go ahead and read this poem. Dissolution Song. Nothing's lost or done for. Untold Jillions toil and till, slit tight hulls, unshroud. A gust tussles lung lichen, tousling an old god's suit to loose a dusty issue. Tuned to a twig, a lone soloist doles out tin lid din, gusto and lust the gist of it. Doused in a sudden glut of sun, logs list to ingot. Dull silt tilts gold. The lids, sun and song stung, wince. Gliding in, wild tidings, tunings, do ti sol, outdoings. Odd unison, gonging song. I solo. Us unglues, nulled. I dote on longing, glut on loss, its insidious sting. Then sun tongues a lone willow, igniting lion's gold. And in gilded rods nodding tiny, loosening moons, I intuit life ongoing. Life, sinuous dissolutionist, tilts ill to still, old to gold, loss to gloss, distills done to ode, going to go in, tunes so lost to solace, dissolves our sighs, one, undone, no one, in its glinting slough. A slough is a swamp. like a wetland, in case that's not a word you're familiar with. I also write poems that think about the way our politics and our social systems change language, bring new idioms into the fore. Again, feel really ambivalent about doing this because I feel like I do harm. But I'm trying to understand how something like disinformation can be seen as not a human invention. We get essentially all of our ideas from nature, right? Around the time of 2016, when an figure I will not mention was elected, I noticed a lot of language that I thought it was just getting repeated. People were like clutching onto it as these like taglines and phrases. And I decided to do, we use a lot of metaphors to talk about the natural world, but here I thought I would have nature take on our language as, that's not really true because I kind of gave it the language, but it was an experiment to see, like, would this language be accurate if applied to the natural world? Would it be as disturbing? Would it be more disturbing? So this poem is deeply unsettling to me. I don't know how I feel about it. And it really has to do, again, with this idea. My children said that I was obsessed with the news, and I was just consuming vast quantities of radio and newspaper news and they're like, Mom, please stop. And so I needed to do something with all of that jargon that had kind of crept into my brain. Some of the stories now breaking. The currents have taken my human figure hostage. The minnow bribes the heron with its piece of silver, ransoming the whole school. On the tabloids of boulders, a trail of evidence. The intestine tautens to burgundy satin. Special report. Among fur snags, a magpie trolls for nest sites, serving notice of eviction to wren and sparrow. Rogue ivy overthrows the madrone. The leaves pad their purses, bearing clusters of grape shot. Casualty report. In the path, splash of blood, tuft of breath feathers. Blind trust. Cherry pits in the scat of the coyote. In the meadow, a hare lines her nest with enemy fur. The killdeer lures me away, fabricating news of an unhinged wing. This is a poem. It's not often you write a poem that creeps you out, right? This really creeps me out. But we're getting some of the darker stuff, right? So this is pollution. This is early 20th century pollution, folks. My hard-drinking Swedish relatives partied on the shore and just broke their bottles right on the rocks. Again, haunted landscapes. But I feel really ambivalent about this because it also is a visible trace of the people I come from, for good or for bad. I'm very drawn to these fragments. I do spend a lot of time, actually, when I go back home, collecting them and throwing them away, but also taking pictures of them, thinking about the language on them, like, why does this one piece say urn? Like a funeral urn or something like that. When I am writing a poem, I feel really torn because as a way of avoiding the pain of a lot of the human-led violence in this world, I am often moved to beautify or to use beautiful language or metaphor. I feel ambivalent about that, but at the same time, and I think to myself, I can't do that. But then I realize that it's all I have. Language is all I have. to describe the things I want to describe. And if that includes human violence, then I often, in my poems, you'll see that there is a kind of record of that ambivalence. And so I wrote a poem called A Chastening. A chastening is when you get scolded, right? And in this poem, I'm literally talking down to myself as if I'm a naughty child. There was a presentation about violence directed toward women and children in various countries in Africa, and the attempts to intervene and so forth. And there was a terrible story about militias and what they would do to these children and in front of their mothers. So I won't go into the details, but it was so shattering to me. I didn't know what to do with the imagery. I just didn't know what to do with it. And of course, it was a lot wrapped up with fear for my own daughters and their safety in this world. And also, you know, you weren't even alive during the Oklahoma City bombing, but that was a huge most of you, pre-9/11 terrorist attack perpetrated by an American in Oklahoma City, during which a daycare was bombed. It was destroyed, and many children died. And I've always held that too, not knowing what to do with it, with this very kind of serious, heavy material, and not wanting to make it beautiful, not wanting to kind of try to transform it so as not to have to look at it. And so this poem is actually an attempt to sort of undoes itself, right? But it is a very unsettling and uneasy poem. And it's not one I read very often because I do have so much ambivalence about it, and this is only a part of it. A chastening. You're doing it again, playing dumb. The monarch shivered in your daughter's palm to fill its glassine wings, not to hitch a harp of fire up her thumb, not to cool so she can stroke sunset's petal. The world gives itself free of charge. Then someone mixes the elements, tapes them on, detonates near a daycare. Your dreams start their centrifuge. Dry grass ignites, day fire sheer. Crust slumps, pours molten toward us. Flame wave overtakes what huddles against the hillside. What is it? What is it? What is? You woke to nails stinging your palms. All morning your pencil worked a puzzle, transliterating flames. Day fire sheer as a brimstone, a metal mark, a clouded sulfur. Someone should confiscate your field guides. So the last, this brimstone, metal mark, and clouds, those are all butterfly names. So trying to, again, to make these flames less horrific. Whew, that's heavy. All right. This is a little segment about my mother and her importance to this project, Reckless Shelter. This image is her photograph. She had dementia. She was collecting stones. She believed that these were artifacts, and some of them were. But she would arrange them and photograph them. Hundreds of photographs. And I actually found them quite beautiful for the way she fit the shapes of the stones together. Also really intrigued by how, as she lost her cognitive ability, she was still trying to make pattern, create something aesthetically beautiful or pleasing to her. She also piled up stones in the roots of the trees on the shore. And every summer when I go home, first thing I go and see if those stones are still there, if the tides have and the tides are beginning to scatter them, but they are still there. So memorial making is a big part of this manuscript. It's largely about, again, as I was mentioning with my obsession with Roland Barthes' morning diary, it is about trying to understand what happens to you when your first home, your mother, is no longer in the world. And so this is a poem that I wrote trying to imagine her death as a natural thing, as looking at the natural world. I saw many evidences that everything perishes and everything passes away. In the background, I think this actually may be the inception. This is my field notebook in the background. I was drawing this plant that was on the shore. I was literally sitting on the shore and drawing this plant and thinking about having scattered my mother's ashes there on the shore. So this is called As It Should Be. Bleached reeds, shattered by the wave's delicate insistence, tallied in lots of 2 or 3, are as they should be. The light glazing the low knuckles on a cast crab shell, turned ruddy as a nipple, is as it should be. The scrawl of leaf litter, mahogany brown, a fine tobacco marking the tide's highest grasp, is as it should be. The brittle monarch tilting this way and that, scudding an inch or 2 in puffs of wind, is as it should be. The salt-tolerant plant, stem torqued and cracked by footfalls, one leaf still reaching its torn palm for the sun, is as it should be. Whether it lives or dies is as it should be. They have taken up your minerals, your elemental particles, because you are not as you should be. Your mind riven by cancer's gall, not as it should be. Not as the whitened leaf held afloat by the oak gall, sentenced to an early fall in barely August. Unless we can say, as the leaf would say, so be it. Unless we can let you be like the dying leaf replete. Another cell in the world's endless unbuilding and rebuilding body. And I'm going to end with a poem called Lunar Eclipse. We are expecting a lunar eclipse in Oregon. I don't know if you're going to see it here. Anyone know? I know it's happening in Oregon because I just got a notice saying that scientific people at my university will help you build a special safe peephole. Or I don't know, maybe this is a solar eclipse. I don't know. It's so far away. This is about a lunar eclipse that I witnessed both as a child. There's a reference to an earlier eclipse, and then also going out when my mother was still alive. I woke my girls, who were 3 and 5, at 2 in the morning and made them come out in the driveway and watch this lunar eclipse. Lunar eclipse. Palm fronds crinkle. The distant whistle of a train draws the mind after, pulls it through childhood's sun-bleached days, album of a half-forgotten country. One moment revives, when a disk of iron slid over the sun's fiery face, and the air went blue, the wind knocked out of it. Inkling of ending, a clench of terror. Then light wheeled through the street again, glorious laughter. Now the earth eats away moon's radiance, morsel by morsel, until her face hangs heavy, rusted by sorrow, and the sky swarms with the infinite milt of stars. Imagine the dread 1,000 years ago, then the rapture's cry. They knew the ruin at the core of our being. We beguile ourselves with innocuous clockworks. Look, at the edge, a brilliant seed grows as the earth moves her benign shoulder. Moon, that farthest face possible to love. Little else in this world will be given back. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for having me in Warsaw. I have had such a wonderful time here, and I have got to go home and process. I just need a couple months to just process everything that I've seen and heard. I feel very grateful to my students, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about writing, about what it takes to become a poet, about my university, about my poetry, anything that you want to ask.